Hi, it's Terry Gross, host of Fresh Air. Hey, take a break from the 24-hour news cycle with us and listen to long-form interviews with your favorite authors, actors, filmmakers, comedians, and musicians, the people making the art that nourishes us and speaks to our times. So listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.
If I say the KUOW Book Club just read a book about shipwrecks in the Northwest, what comes to mind? Bad weather? Old English paintings of grand ships being tossed around on the waves? Maybe a Kraken? Well, what about settler colonialism? Yeah, I bet that's not one of the first things exactly, but author and historian Coll Thrush wants to change that. I'm Katie Campbell, and you're listening to a bonus episode of Meet Me Here, KUOW's Arts and Culture podcast. I also run the KUOW Book Club, and in February, we read Coll's latest book, Wrecked, Unsettling Histories from the Graveyard of the Pacific. I sat down with Coll on February 26th in front of a live audience at the Seattle Central Library to talk about how shipwrecks brought settlers and Indigenous peoples suddenly, violently, together, and how we've made sense of time and space through the wreckage. Thank you so much for joining us. And just while you get settled there, I just want to share that I picked Wrecked for the KUOW Book Club this month for a few reasons. I mean, one, it was the winner of the 2026 Pacific Northwest Book Award. Another round of applause. Yeah. You know it's got to be good at that point. Two, I kind of loved this idea of exploring our region's cultural history through the lens of shipwrecks. We were talking backstage that my partner, Drew, said, this is a book for Michigan war dads. I was like, Cole's not from Michigan. He's not a war dad as far as I know. He's like, no, like shipwrecks, that's their vibe. And the third reason I picked it is because while that might feel like an entry point, it really challenges us to look at something like shipwrecks differently. And I love that. And I think, some Michigan war dads could stand to do that sometimes. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, no, it's really good to be here. This is a hometown audience for me, so it feels really good to see some familiar faces and, to be back home.
So what I want to say, first of all, to folks who maybe haven't read the book yet or haven't read it all the way through, I want to start by encouraging you to read the footnotes, because there are some gems in these footnotes. From the very first one, Coll, I learned that you have a friend who says your drag name should be Clam Patty. Is that right?
That's right. And she is here tonight somewhere in the audience. That's my dear friend, Mary. Yeah, the book opens with something I'm very proud of, which is a memoir piece about growing up, going out to the coast to hunt razor clams with my family, and that for a lot of particularly working class families, that was a really common pastime. And that was kind of my family's connection to the coast. But when we would be out on the coast, we would often visit shipwreck sites. Like some of you will remember the Katala that was on in Ocean Shores for a long time, and Peter Iredale, which is still on the beach today in Northern Oregon and is on the cover of the book. And so I wanted to kind of, with that preface, talking about the razor clams and all this, to show my investment in the subject. This is a personal subject for me. And so to do that kind of writing, historians are supposed to keep everything at arm's length, right? And I'm just not interested in that at this point in my career. And so I really wanted to show the reader sort of my own positionality almost in relationship to the subject, that this is very close to home for me. And I think one of my goals with the book was to write to other people who love this place. I'm a terrible regional chauvinist. And I think we live in the best place in the world. And I include BC as well as Washington and Oregon in that. And I wanted that to come across in the book and to speak to those people.
That gets at the question I was going to ask about why shipwrecks. So, I mean, it is personal. And as I think you lay out in this book, so much of history, especially when we're talking about settler colonial history, is personal. Can we back up just a little bit and talk about how you even came to be a historian and why you wanted to focus, too, on the Indigenous peoples of these lands?
Yeah, I came to history really late. I thought history was all, Hitler and the presidents, and that you memorize dates and all that is sort of how it was taught in junior high and high school down in Auburn. And so I kind of avoided history in university. I went to Fairhaven College at Western Washington University up in Bellingham. It was only in my last year I took a course called The Historian as Detective. I'd been designing a self-designed major in Northwest Coast Studies, but it hadn't occurred to me to take history. And this course was all about history as process rather than history as data. And it really opened a door for me. I was headed to law school at the time. That was going to be my big next step. And so I got saved from that fate. Maybe I would have been an okay lawyer. I don't know. Yeah, it was about history as process. And I realized that all the things I was interested in, these ideas of place, these ideas of belonging, were actually history. History was a way to get at that. And the archive was a way to get at that. I discovered that I really loved digging around in other people's stuff and telling stories about them, which is basically what historians do. And so history came really late to me. And so when I entered graduate school, I had a very steep learning curve to get caught up. But history for me has become really a way of life in a way. And I love living in a region that is so bookish, where people are really invested in that sense of place.
City of literature and all.
Yeah, that's right.
It feels like history, maybe much like English, as like a area of study, is kind of maligned, especially when you're in like grade school. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, you have to know these factoids or you have to read these classics. Mm-hmm. Was there something that really grabbed your attention and made you think, wait a minute, I never thought of it that way?
Yeah, it was when I first encountered, oddly, the work of an anthropologist from the early 20th century who collected place names from local Indigenous peoples. And that ended up filtering into what became the Atlas of Native Seattle. And that was such a powerfully disorienting experience in a way that was so useful. It was really a radical transformation of my thinking about the place. That there were these deep histories, and these place names are almost like photographs of what the landscape was like and what it still means for people. That place name piece really threw for me into relief the fact that all of this is really recent. It's just this very recent, fragile interruption in this thousands and thousands of years of history in this place.
And we will talk about place names, but I want to stick with that disorienting feeling you had, because you aim to do that in your work, right? You are trying to challenge the reader. Was that also part of the change in how you saw history? Was it also in how you wanted others to see it? Is it supposed to be disorienting?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what I tell my students, that's my job, is to disorient them. And provide them with some tools to reorient and all that. It's not just to create chaos in the classroom, but to have them take things they think they know and look at them from new angles. That's a really, and I don't think I'm special in doing that. It's because it's happened to me as well. The people that I read and the people who came before me as scholars and as writers and authors have done that for me. And so I'm trying to carry that forward. And I guess one of the most important things I like to think about is this idea that we are all inside the story. That's something that I try to really get across in my classes, that all of us are inside the big story. And by big story, I mean colonialism, among other things, that we are all inside it. I say to my students, you could be a fourth generation Vancouverite. Maybe you just got here from Korea. Maybe your family's been here for 4,000 years. All of us are inside this story. And right there, I think students start to latch on to something that is quite disorienting, but also really empowering.
Well, I want to put everybody here into the story a little bit this evening. So I'd love to have you read a passage from pages 194 and 195. So it's towards the end of the book, but I think it captures so much. And I think it's also helpful in transporting us to some of the spaces that you talk about in the book. So when you're ready.
January 26, 1700. The depth of winter, the heart of storytelling season. It's night on the Nehalem, families tucked cozily into longhouses curving around the lip of the estuary, protected from the open Pacific by a wide spit. As the people prepare to sleep, one man sits working on a new arrowhead, chipping away to find its shape in the raw material. But this is no typical projectile point. It is neither chert nor obsidian. It is porcelain, bright white and blue in the light of the fire. Taken from a strange giant canoe that had come to the Nehalem shore a few years earlier, wrecking itself in the sands, the porcelain glimmers in the flickering light as the hunter works carefully at its sharp edges. Suddenly, the earth begins to shake violently. The longhouse rattles and sways, and the people, children, women, men, old people, cry out in fear. Out in the night, the sea withdraws from the shore. Had anyone been out there in the darkness to witness it, they would have seen the surf pull far away, revealing deep places no human person should ever see. Then the sea comes back in vast house-high white waves. The waves overrun the spit and barrel toward the homes of the Nehalem as, all along the coast, the tsunami rushes eastward, running up river valleys, crashing against cliffs, and tearing all asunder as the earth-shaking subsides. Somewhere in the midst of this obliteration rests the hardwood bones of a ship, source of the porcelain the hunter had been making into an arrowhead, and origin of the strange yellow pitch-like substance that the people have been experimenting with for the past few years. The violent surf tears apart whatever remains of the vessel. Some of its beams, caught in the maelstrom, are thrown high above the tide line into a cave at the foot of the mountain where the Great Spirit lives.
Yeah, that gets a little applause. Come on now. Thank you. So we were talking earlier about this chapter. Mm-hmm. It's told in reverse.
That's right.
So this is 7 years after that ship, which was the Santo Cristo de Burgos, had wrecked. Mm-hmm. And as you say later, as you know, it sets into motion so much because it is the earliest known colonial presence on the Northwest coast. Mm-hmm. That is the first contact that we're aware of and the first wreckage. Mm-hmm. What did that ship set into motion when it crashed here?
Yeah, I teach a course called First Contacts in the Pacific, and one of the things that we talk a lot about and wrestle with in that course is how an event like the wrecking of Santo Cristo de Burgos in 1693 both begins everything and begins nothing simultaneously. It's a story that had almost been forgotten. I mean, it's still held by local indigenous peoples. There's lots of folklore around it, conspiracy theories and all this that have sort of accreted on the wreck over the last 300 years. But for me, it's the beginning of the colonial project, of course. But it's also, for me, a lesson in oblivion, in the sense that I think historians, what we do is we walk up to the edge of what can be known all the time, and 99% of that is lost to us. That 1%, if it's even that much, is the archive. And for me, Santo Cristo de Burgos really captures that. And the fact that that wreck was only the timbers of the wreck were only found in 2022, for me really speaks to the fact that these ships don't stop sailing. They keep going. Anytime there's a big storm and a ship emerges from the sand, we start telling stories about it. Every time there's an anniversary of a big wreck, we tell stories about it. And so the ships are not dead at all. They're not dead things. They're living beings in a way.
Certainly the ghosts as kind of one of the metaphors you paint in history, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, to stay with this particular wreck, you start this chapter telling what might sound familiar. And I think you said a friend thought, oh gosh, has Coll lost his mind? Is he not a very good historian? Because you tell the story of what we know as the Goonies, mm-hmm. which was inspired by a shipwreck like this. Like, what does that tell you about the power of something like wreckage mm-hmm. and settler colonialism? Yeah,
it was so fun to write about the Goonies. In 1985, I was a youngish kid. And to play with the folklore that has, again, accreted, sort of solidified around this particular wreck was a really satisfying experience because it really, to me, spoke to the ways in which shipwreck has become central to regional culture in so many ways. And it tells us so much about what's going on in terms of how settlers claim place, how indigenous people continue to claim place, and those intersections. And I think what I tried to do with that last chapter by running it in reverse was first to give the book kind of a tidal structure. It goes forward in time and then backward in time. But then also it sort of follows the argument. What I'm arguing is that if you pull back all these layers of folklore and the Goonies and all this kind of stuff, you get to the original indigenous oral tradition, which is the bedrock of all history in the Northwest. And so the form of the chapter really follows what I'm trying to argue there.
Yeah, you cite a couple of historians, but one who, I don't remember exactly how you put it or how she put it, but basically that by discovering Santo Cristo de Burgos, it proved the effectiveness of oral tradition mm-hmm. in the tribes who had for years known about this wreck. Yeah. And maybe it was turned into something completely different, but mm-hmm. it showed the lasting effects.
That's right.
And throughout the book, we as the reader get to hear from so many different people. We get your own personal story at the beginning, but then we hear from people who are still with us maybe today, but a lot of folks, both settler, colonialist, and indigenous, who witnessed these things. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's one that really sticks with you, that really haunts you, that changed how you thought even about your own work here in this book.
The one that comes to mind right now was the worst wreck in the history of the graveyard of the Pacific. It was called SS Pacific. It was a steam sidewheeler. And in 1875, in November, it was struck by another ship called Orpheus off of Cape Flattery. And it sunk immediately. There were over 300 people on board and only 2 survived. And one of the survivors described the sidewheeler going under and the sea just being full of screaming people. And then it went silent. And so if you've ever seen Titanic, it's that scene when the ship's gone and the sea is just full of people crying out. And to come across that kind of story in the archive is really powerful, to just sort of sit with somebody's, sort of blood-curdling firsthand experience like that. But one of the things that I tried to think about and write about with that was the ways in which that kind of trauma, and to give you a sense of scale, it was going from Victoria to San Francisco. About 1 in 15 Victorians died in that wreck. So really a significant event. That kind of trauma became a way for settlers to claim place, in the sense that we died for this, so now it's ours. It's similar to the story of the Oregon Trail. All those graves along the trail became a way for Americans to say, this is ours now. And that was something I saw going on with shipwrecks as well, was settlers saying, our dead are here, so this place is ours now. We've sort of earned it. Pacific was a great example of that. Pacific's also a great example of these ships not dying. So it was just found recently, and there's a sonar of the 2 side wheels that have been found about 1,000 feet down off of Cape Flattery. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, because there's about 900 pounds of Fraser River gold on the ship. And so who's going to get the gold? Can it even be gotten? The story's not over. 1875 to 2026. The story's not done yet.
This is where I pitch you on a project to go get that gold, Coll.
Yeah.
Who's in?
I don't do deep water anything. I don't dive. I don't sail.
I'm licensed scuba diver, and let me tell you, it's terrifying.
Yep. No, thank you.
We should also probably back up a bit and talk about how this book could even be written. The fact of the graveyard of the Pacific being in our collective backyard. Talk a little bit about the scales. Just that one shipwreck was about 300 people that we know of. Yeah. You go through wreck after wreck after wreck, sometimes in great detail and some quickly.
Yeah. After the book came out, I asked myself a question that hadn't occurred to me to ask before, which was how many ships are actually in this book? Yeah. And there's about 106 individual shipwrecks, I think, in the book. And that's 1/20th about of the number of ships that have gone down in the graveyard of the Pacific. So there's about 2,000 total. And of course, that's a really imprecise number necessarily. But that really speaks to the scale of it. And there are kind of 2 nexuses of disaster. One is the bar at the Columbia mouth, where you get 40-foot standing waves, and probably about half the wrecks happened there. And then the other is the southwest coast of Vancouver Island, where ships kind of fail to make that starboard turn into the Strait of Juan de Fuca and then just hit the island. There's a ton of shipwrecks there. And one of the things I found was that it was just so ubiquitous and kind of quotidian. A single storm could take out 10 ships, and they would never be seen again. So there are chapters where I just sort of am almost listing ships. And my editor and I kind of went back and forth about that a little bit. This feels a little listy, but that's kind of the point, right? It's just again and again and again that these wrecks are happening. And so I wanted the experience of the reader to sort of get at that, oh my God, another one,
Well, you can let your editor know that I at least thought you did a great job of that, because it did feel that way of just, here we go again. And also to think, and I want us all to think a little bit about too, for people here who had never seen a thing like that, like Santo Cristo de Burgos, this giant freewheeling, probably looking like thing just bashing against the rocks. What stands out to you in your research about that, of just the Indigenous experience of not only are you meeting these new people for the first time at the worst possible moment as they're thrown to the shore, hopefully alive, but also to see this monstrosity show up on your shore?
Yeah, it was really interesting to me how much material there was about Indigenous perspectives on shipwrecks in the archive. I did a relatively small amount of work with Indigenous archives like tribal or First Nations archives because there was so much already in the colonial archive, firsthand accounts that were published in 1924, for example, or whatever. There was so much. And one of my favorite pieces in the archive came from a treaty negotiation on the Chehalis River in 1855 when a chief from the Chinook Nation called KUOW said, everything that comes ashore is mine. And he meant, drift logs, he meant whales, and he meant shipwrecks. And Governor Isaac Ingalls Stevens was really not down for that. Right. No,
Surprise.
Those ships are ours. Yeah. And so it so surprised me that again and again in these treaty negotiations, you had shipwrecks coming up. And it never ended up in the treaty, of course, but that really speaks to a sense of longstanding, very robust legal orders that exist on this coast even today, that people have jurisdiction over, that the tribes, the First Nations have jurisdiction over these territories, including the waters. And so I really wanted that to come across, especially in that chapter that's called Everything That Comes Ashore Is Mine.
And I like the macaw name that you share for these maritime newcomers. Mm-hmm. This is on page 36, and you're going to help me with this word. Yeah. Babahid.
Babahid.
But it means those living on the water and floating around like they have no land. Mm-hmm. And I wrote my notes, accidental sick burn, ? Because really when you think about what that would have been like to not only see this ship show up on the horizon and these people and to see the destruction of it, but then suddenly you have these newcomers, these Babahid that you have to deal with in some way or other. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about the various ways that was addressed and how it really was, these shipwrecks were this collision of cultures.
Yeah, there's a long history that's been kind of hidden on this coast, and that's the history of Indigenous rescue of sailors and shipwreck victims and so on. And it's been really overshadowed by a history of violence because there is violence, especially from the fur trade era. There were some really pretty powerful moments of violence between Indigenous and newcomer people on the coast. But what I found again and again in the archive was these little sort of fragmentary references of things like, the Indians took the survivors to Victoria, and that's all there was. But if you start to add that up over time, you see that Indigenous people are in fact the primary rescuers almost up into the 20th century. And it is really at odds, though, with the mythology around it. There's a story that always sort of sticks with me that captures that violence. 1864, a wreck called Kingfisher, where there were 3 men who died in that wreck. That was all the crew. And in the Ahousaht territory of the Nuu-chah-nulth people on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And in Victoria, newspaper editors and others kind of ginned up a story that the crew had been killed by the Ahousaht and sent up 2 warships and bombed all the Ahousaht villages, destroyed all the canoes, killed a bunch of people. And then in one of the most perverse things I've ever seen in an archive, they took a small, maybe 4-year-old girl from the community and named her after the ship that had just bombed her community and gave her to the captain's wife. And she died 2 years later. So stories have since emerged that in fact, and this makes it complicated, that those 3 sailors were in fact killed by the Ahousaht because they had sexually assaulted an Ahousaht woman. And that's emerging in a documentary that's in production right now that I'm part of. And so layers upon layers of violence. But again, those stories of violence really take all the oxygen out of the room, when in fact it was Indigenous rescue that is the story that I tried to surface, pun intended.
Every Friday on Seattle Now, we break down the week's news. This week, Seattle knows how to party, but boy, we left behind a lot of trash at the Seahawks Super Bowl parade.
If I do produce trash, I'm going to carry it with me.
You're absolutely.
That gal. Yeah, no question. Yeah. For as long as I need to. I'm a trash gal. Did you see me?
Hear that and more on Seattle Now, wherever you get your podcasts.
The other thing that occurred to me when you were talking about this tradition of Indigenous rescue too was there'd be a ship that was still actively listing. Maybe there's an opportunity to save more of what's on it or the people that's on it, but we can't get another ship close enough. And then you would tell maybe of a local tribe bringing the canoes out and being able to board. And it's just like the concept of scale was also different, it seemed. How did the approach of Indigenous rescuers maybe affect how we approach it today?
Well, one of the things that came across again and again, I keep saying that phrase, in the archive is how much better the canoes were than the ships on this coast, and that everybody knew that, right? And that lifeboats turn over, they're only useful for the iron that's in them, really. So there's a sense of, again, I think it comes back to kind of jurisdiction and Indigenous knowledge of place and Indigenous adaptation to this place, and that adaptation that took place over thousands of years. Right. And so, and everybody seems to be aware of that in these stories. And there aren't, at least in the archive that I looked at, there weren't a lot of stories of loss of canoes. There were some, and there were some stories of death there, and I tried to kind of steer clear of that because those aren't really my stories to tell. But it doesn't have the same kind of metaphorical oomph that shipwreck does in settler society. We use shipwreck as metaphor all the time to speak to, the dissolution of a marriage or the wrecking of a civilization or whatever. We use that kind of metaphor, and it's really powerful stuff, and that's what makes good storytelling.
Or the colonialism wrecking itself on Indigenous shores, I think is how you put it in the preface.
Yeah, that was this book came together really quickly, and one of the reasons it did is because right off the bat, that idea came to me of colonialism wrecking itself on Indigenous shores, and it sort of just lightning bolted itself into me. And when you're writing a book, when you get that central metaphor, that central image, things start to fall away. The dross kind of falls away, and you end up with the core story that you're trying to tell. And I'm really grateful that came early, because it only took 6 years to write this book.
Oh, only 6 years, that's all.
That's fast for history.
And it's a heavily researched book, so yes, that does sound fast. But I want to go back to something you just said, where you felt some of the stories that came up in the archives and came up through your research weren't yours to tell. Can you talk a little bit about deciding which stories you can comfortably tell and which just aren't for you?
Yeah, an example of that is the story I just told about the Ahoza girl, and we don't know her proper name. It hasn't come down in the archive, including the Ahoza haven't shared it. I really thought, there's a picture of her that's in the BC archives, and she's wearing a dress and she's holding a little basket, and I really debated whether to show that picture or not in the book. It was something I really thought about, and I thought, this is a picture of her in abject captivity, right? And I wasn't able to make a connection with the Ahoza community, so it sort of wasn't my picture to show. It's such a violent image, even though it's made to look like a little girl in the Victorian period. And it is that. But that was an example where I thought, okay, just pull back a little bit. You don't have to show everything. So I describe it, and I have a footnote that describes my decision making. And I think anytime as writers, if we're crossing those cultural boundaries and so on, anytime we can make our decision making process kind of transparent and visible, I think that's really important. Yeah. Because it says, I'm thinking about this, and you should too.
And I think that's what's great about the book, right? Because it's throughout, you're essentially asking the reader to think a little bit more deeply. So going back to these folks who are encountering these shipwrecks as they happen, I mean, what struck me throughout these stories was, like, to put it very mildly, how annoying it could have been to go from, you're having a normal day, and all of a sudden you have a sense of responsibility, as you describe a lot of folks having, Indigenous people having, as these people come to their shores, dead or alive. How did that sense of responsibility for what does come to your shores shape these interactions as well?
They shape them really deeply. I mean, a good example of that is a wreck in 1808 called the Sviatoy Nikolai, or the St. Nicholas, which is a Russian trading vessel that wrecked in Quileute territory on what we now call the Olympic Peninsula. There were 20 people on board. They all survived. About half of them were captured by the Quileute. The other half went up into the hills and ate their belts and killed their dogs to eat them, and were really in desperate straits. And they tried to ransom the captain's wife back from the Quileute, and she refused. she decided she'd rather stay with the Quileute. And so what happens in these early stories is that survivors are actually, again, being kind of brought into existing networks of trade, of even maybe kinship. They're being brought into relationships. They're being brought into that jurisdiction of the nations and tribes that are along the coast. So again, for me, it's, I feel like one of the things I try to get across in my classes as well is this idea of colonialism being just this veneer, this very thin, shallow veneer over 10, 12, 14, whatever thousand years of history in this place. That kind of comes across, I think, in these encounters too.
That definitely does. And the other thing that you are reminding readers of is despite the devastation that these shipwrecks caused and the great risk that was taken just by trying to set sail with a load of timber, for example, and despite finding people who had their own societies, that settler colonialism persisted. And in a lot of ways, as you show us in the book, these shipwrecks deepened those colonialist ties to this land. Can you talk a little bit about why that is? What stands out to you about that connection between wreckage and claiming a space?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about that idea of trauma as a claim, loss as a claim, grief as a claim, mourning as a claim. That just really emerged from the archive. I really saw that in a lot of different examples. And one of the things I tried to do with the book, though, was to talk about 3 myths that came with colonialism to this place. First, the myth that nature would be endlessly abundant and controllable. Second, that indigenous peoples would disappear. And third, that the past would stay past. And none of those things have proven to be true, right? And Shipwreck is a great way to talk about that, about those 3 stories and to sort of capsize them.
Yeah. So on page 121, you also argue, quote, naming is power, and these wreck names in the graveyard of the Pacific are acts of claiming. So we started talking about that a little bit earlier, but say more about the power of a name, especially in a place like the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, I think there are shipwreck place names all up and down the coast. So the town of Florence, Oregon, for example, is named after a shipwreck. Cannon Beach is named after cannons from a shipwreck. It used to be called Elk Creek, and then they renamed the town after the cannons. Valencia Bluffs on Vancouver Island. All these place names that are acts of claiming. And so they are overwriting another set of names. Just like Mount Rainier overwrites Tacloba, right? That's, again, this act of claiming. But one of the things I wanted to really highlight in the book and in my work more generally is that claiming is fragile, right? It's not permanent. It used to be the Queen Charlotte Islands for a little while. Now it's Haida Gwaii again. And so that naming is, again, shallow, right? It's only briefly here. And the possibility of going back to those other names, which have never gone away, is there as well. And one of the things that I've learned from being in Indigenous studies the last 10 or 15 years is, again, this idea of thinking about colonialism as an interruption, which is about futurity. It's about saying there is a future beyond colonialism as we know it today. And I have a picture I often use during my Q&A sessions when I give a PowerPoint presentation, and it's of an unknown shipwreck on at Ucluelet on Vancouver Island. And it's just the wooden ribs of a ship. Nobody knows what ship it was, and it has a Sitka spruce growing up out of it. And I just think that's the metaphor. Out of the wreckage of colonialism, something new might emerge, right? And so I sort of leave that up on the screen as a metaphor while we talk. Sure. Yeah.
So I also appreciated in the chapter where you acknowledge this tendency, I think, to see shipwrecks as like ghost stories, as they're kind of spooky. We got these ghost pirates. And then you pivot to the real horror that's there of environmental disaster that modern ships in particular with diesel fuel pose. But these things are haunting in a lot of ways. Including in the way that settler society has adopted some of these wrecks into tourism. What does that tell you about settler society in particular and the capitalist nature in which some of these shipwrecks exist even today?
Yeah, one of the things I was really interested in was thinking about how do you develop a culture on the coast, and shipwreck is a great way to talk about that because it has become such an iconic part of coastal culture. Postcards that you can buy, or and the stories that get told. One of the coolest things that I found in the archives was something that should never have survived. It's a paper placemat from an Astoria restaurant from before 1965 that has it's a map of shipwrecks, and like that's shipwreck culture, right? Which I just find really fascinating. But there's also this kind of haunted quality of the coast. I open one chapter, I think, by saying, if you call something a graveyard long enough, you're going to end up with ghosts. And I can't get away from ghosts in all my work. They show up in everything I write. I teach a class called Haunted Histories, which is super fun, about how the past haunts the present, and we tell those stories sometimes through ghosts. But what I tried to do in that chapter was actually say they're the ghosts of the past of these ships, but there's another ghost that haunts the coast from the future, and that's the oil spill. And so I pulled up the history of oil spills on the Northwest coast, which are largely forgotten because they're not sexy, right? They're barges, they're freighters, they don't have big raggedy sails. They're not romantic in any way. And so that history has largely been forgotten. So I kind of tried to resurface that history and argue that the tribes, the First Nations, the province, the states, both federal governments are all prepped. They're all ready for the big one. So the future is kind of haunting the present in a way. So I end that chapter by talking about a ghost hunting TV show where they went to it's called the Graveyard of the Pacific, and these four bros come to Astoria and freak each other out. And it's hilarious. But I argue they're looking in the wrong direction. They're looking in the past. The real ghost is in the future.
There are other ghosts too, especially with these oil spills, arguably hundreds of thousands of them in the marine life, right? And I want to talk briefly about the symbolic animal, if you will, of wrecked. Talk a little bit about the razor clam and what's so important about it to this book.
Yeah, back to clam patty.
Back to clam patty, exactly.
Yeah, every book I write has kind of a signature species. And so with Native Seattle, it was, of course, salmon. When I wrote Indigenous London, it was the raven, like the ravens at the tower. And this one, I thought it would be octopus. I thought it would be this alternative consciousness, seeing these ships kind of raining down from the surface, but it ended up being razor clam, which is close. It's a mollusk, right? It's still in the zone, but it doesn't show up beyond the preface so much. It shows up a little bit in the chapter on oil spills. But for me, it's been really important to have kind of this iconic thing, being, maybe is a better way of saying it, at the heart of the story, even if it's just kind of back here in my head as I'm writing, or here on my shin where I got a tattoo of the razor clam, which is a weird thing to have a tattoo of, it turns out.
I love it.
Yeah.
But they symbolize a lot, right? Not just for the book, but for the region and for the Indigenous people who live here. Like, this is a dire piece of the food chain, really.
Yeah. I think what I saw with the stories of the oil spills on the coast was that they became opportunities for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to again lay claim to the place, particularly volunteers who helped, use dish soap on the birds to get the oil off them and so on, and the just the violence of an oil spill. And what I saw in the archive there was people both saying, I am defending this place. I'm trying to rescue this place. And for both, especially Indigenous people, but also for non-Indigenous people, this was a way to deepen their relationship with place. And that's the question that has animated all my work from the beginning, from doing my dissertation that became Native Seattle, is what does it mean to lay claim to a place? But what does it mean to claim allegiance to a place? What does it mean for me to say I'm a regional chauvinist and we live in the best place in the world as a settler? What work does that do politically, culturally, and otherwise? So my work has always been really interested with ideas of belonging. What does it mean to belong to a place? That's at the core of what I do.
I want to talk about another kind of sort of marine life, the seagull of years past, not the bird. The human seagulls that would show up after the wreckage and take things that showed up, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that aspect too?
One of the chapters deals with what I call the construction of local culture. And by that, I mean literally people building their lives out of stuff that came off of shipwrecks. Right. And so it could be lumber, it could be railroad ties, it could be Stetson hats, it could be Chinese silk scarves, It could be frozen Christmas turkeys. And again, throughout the archive, you see it in photographs as well, all these things washing ashore. Sometimes they've been thrown overboard. Sometimes they've just fallen overboard. Sometimes the ship has opened up and let them all go. And people, both indigenous and settler, are building their lives out of this stuff. And so what's interesting is that when indigenous people do it, it's often called plunder, but not always. And when white people do it, it's often called salvage, but not always. There are different kinds of sort of folk traditions on the coast. So, for example, people going out on the Long Beach Peninsula, going out and collecting things off ships, were referred to as seagulls. Mm-hmm. I did a documentary this summer, a different documentary, down in Astoria, and I talked with a woman who works at a local museum there, and her grandmother used to cook with lard that had come off a shipwreck. Oh, wow. And so we talked about her making pies out of this jetsam that had come off some ship.
Talk about ghosts.
Yeah, right? Yeah, it's not just a metaphor. People are literally building their lives out of the material stuff of shipwrecks.
So you have a whole 200-plus page book here, Coll, all about this question, but I want to ask in a brief way, if that's even possible. At the end of all of this research, what does shipwreck mean to you?
I guess the fertility of failure. Not futility, but fertility. Yeah. That failure opens up all kinds of stories. We tend to think of colonialism as this thing that triumphed, that won. And in the moments where we can see it failing, I think a whole other set of stories open up that are really powerful, that are about things like Indigenous persistence, about new ways of thinking about time, and so on. So for me, working with these failures has been really, really fertile.
You also mentioned, right, a grad student who helped you look at that failure a little differently. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so I really want to give a shout out to Dr. Sarah Fox, who was my research assistant for 2 years on this project. She's now faculty at Prescott College in Arizona. She works on communities that experienced radiogenic violence, so like downwinder communities and so on. She was, my research assistant for 2 years, and she went into the newspaper archives and found literally thousands of newspaper articles. Research is so different now since newspapers have been digitized. It's a fundamentally different scene now than it was even 10 years ago. The conversations with her really made this book possible. That relationship is really deeply meaningful to me. And she and I are working on a piece together called Debris Fields, where we're bringing together her work and my work to talk about how is a shipwreck like a radioisotope. And we're looking at the mouth of the Columbia, where you have radioisotopes from Hanford, you have shipwreck debris, and what does it mean to write in the wreckage of Northwest history? So that's a piece we're working on together and sort of thinking through together.
I want to start wrapping up with a question that you ask on page 199. And you write, is the tide still coming in or is it going out? Mm-hmm. And I would just add to it slightly and ask, is the tide of colonialism, of history, of what we might call civilization, and maybe even of humanity's time on this earth, is the tide still coming in or is it going out?
Wow, you went big with that.
I did.
Yeah. Yeah, I end every book I write with a question. And so in Native Seattle, it was what happened here. In Indigenous London, it was when did we become real human beings? And then in this book, it was is the tide coming in or is it going out? However I framed that. And that is what I was talking about that metaphor of the ribs of the ship with the tree growing out of it. Is there a possible future that is not like our present? I suppose it's about hope, but it's also about the fact that history is a collective endeavor, that my story that I've written here is not the end, right? If all goes well, I'll be obsolete at some point because that's how it's supposed to work, right? This is a collective project. And that's what I tell particularly my graduate students when they're freaking out. I say, no, this is collective. Just slow down. You're okay, right? This is a collective endeavor. You don't have to control all the story. And so that's why I end with questions, is to leave a door open for the next person to come along and critique me or challenge me completely, say I missed something, whatever, that it is really a collective process.
So my last question comes from something you said on page 80, and you talk about the stories of two shipwrecks. One you mentioned, the Kingfisher, and the John Bright, and you wrote, quote, they carried within them the possibility of long-awaited reconciliation. And I want to ask if you think that reconciliation was ever achieved. can it be achieved, especially after all that has been done in the name of settler colonialism?
Well, I don't think we know because we haven't really started it yet. You know, in Canada, we've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission around the residential schools there. I hear so many people say that they want to move on with reconciliation without dealing with the truth part first. Like, truth comes first. And then when my students get all sort of freaked out, what does reconciliation mean? What are we going to do? What's going to happen? I remind them that in the grand scheme of things, that conversation just started yesterday. It's just starting, so I don't think we know. It took decades, centuries for us to get into this situation. It's a long game, right? Reconciliation is a long game, but truth comes first, and I think that's a role that historians can play, along with others.
So from your perspective as a historian then, in a perfect world, and maybe not because that doesn't exist, what could reconciliation look like?
Land back. It could look like that. It could look like ending the violence against missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It could look like that too.
Yep. That's why we'll be talking to Sasha Takshablu-LaPointe in part.
That's right. It means platforming people like her, maybe more than people like me.
Yeah. Truly, if you have not signed up yet, sign up for the Sasha Talk. I have been working for 2 years, folks, to bring her here, and I am incredibly excited to get to meet her.
And just to really quickly add to that, so Sasha carries a name, Takshablu, which many of you will know was the name that was carried by Vi Hilbert, who was a language teacher. She was an elder. She was so much more than those things. And so to have someone who carries that name in this space is really a big deal.
But in the meantime, Coll Thrush is the author of Wrecked, Unsettling Histories from the Graveyard of the Pacific. Thank you for joining me.
This was fun.
And thank you for listening to this bonus episode of Meet Me Here. I spoke to Coll Thrush for a KUOW Book Club live event in partnership with the Seattle Public Library on February 26th. And as you just heard, our next author will be Sasha Takshablu-LaPointe. She'll join me at the Seattle Central Library on March 23rd to talk about her essay collection, Thundersong. It's free, but you have to RSVP, and you can do so at kuow.org/events. And you can join the KUOW Book Club at kuow.org/books. Thanks again for listening to this bonus episode of Meet Me Here. Meet Me Here is produced by KUOW, a proud member of the NPR network. It's hosted by me, Katie Campbell, Dyer Oxley, and Jeannie Yandel, and it's produced by Brandy Fullwood, Kyle Norris, and Matt Martin. Our editor is Phyllis Fletcher. You can find more and support the show at kuow.org/meet. I'm Katie Campbell, and I'll meet y'all back here for our next regularly scheduled episode on Wednesday.
Everything is expensive in Seattle. But when it comes to restaurants, I got a lot of tricks and tips up my sleeve to help diners eat well in this city. I'm Ton Ben, host of Seattle Eats, a food podcast from the Seattle Times and KUOW, part of the NPR network. I'll share about the latest buzz in the Seattle food scene, like the hottest openings and the best bites that are worth your money. Listen now to Seattle Eats on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.